Thanks for joining me. I am Mr. Wilson from the TCP Academy, tcp-academy.teachable.com. You can also find us on YouTube at CSEC Biology TCP. We are looking at the CSEC syllabus, and today we're going to be looking at classification, which happens to be the second bit of lesson for the CSEC syllabus. The first, of course, was characteristics of living things. We're going to be doing an overview of that, and then we're going to be hopping right into classification. So we are at section A of a syllabus, living organisms in the ecosystem, and the objectives are grouping living organisms based on observable similarities and differences, draw and populate table, classify organisms into taxonomic groups such as kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. We're also going to be doing a flowchart and a dichotomous key and just be talking a little bit about DNA sequencing. Characteristics of living things, we have an entire video on Teachable, and you can also find copies of a video on our YouTube channel, CSEC Biology TCP. How much do you remember? The memory aid Mrs. Gren is used to remind us of the characteristics of living things. First being M there for movement / locomotion, which are not pretty much the same. They are somewhat different in that movement is a term that is usually used correctly when referring to plants. Locomotion and movement can, however, be used to refer to animals. The difference is that with locomotion, the entire organism is displaced from point A to point B, while in movement, it is just a part of the organism that might be moving. If you were supposed to move your hand to your face to wipe your face, that would have been movement. But if you were supposed to walk over to mom, then that would have been locomotion. Then we have reproduction, the ability to produce an offspring, followed by sensitivity and irritability, which speaks to our ability to respond to changes in the environment or to respond to that which we refer to as a stimulus. Followed by growth and development. Growth and development refers to a permanent increase in size or complexity of an organism. Then we have respiration, which is pretty much the ability of the organism, the cell, to release energy through what we refer to as respiration. Then we have excretion, and this is a pretty fancy word here. Excretion is, of course, a removal of metabolic waste from the organism. Feces must never ever be confused as excretory material, as feces is an ingestible material. So at no point should we make that mistake. More can be said about feces, but we're going to leave that until we get to the topic excretion. Then we have nutrition and feeding, which refers to the ability of an organism to, of course, consume, make food, whichever one. We could talk about three different types of nutrition here. We could talk about autotrophic nutrition, where organisms are able to produce their own food, heterotrophic nutrition, where organisms are relying on other organisms for food, and of course, saprophytic nutrition, where organisms are feeding on the dead remains of other organisms. So, Mrs. Gren, we could do a comparison here of living and non-living organism, movement and locomotion. Of course, living things would be doing that. So too will be non-living. If we look at reproduction, of course, living things can reproduce. However, non-living things can't reproduce. You really can't pull a car door off and get a new organism from the car door. Sensitivity and irritability, yes, living things can, and also non-living. You can recall the alarm going off on the car because something wasn't right. The headlight is left on, the seat belt is just not latched as it should, the door is not properly closed, you're too close to the car. All that sensitivity and irritability. The smoke alarm in your house or in industries, Those are also examples of non-living things that express sensitivity and irritability. If we look at growth and development, it is confined only to living organisms. Non-living things cannot grow. So non-living things can't grow, they can't reproduce. Non-living things can respire because it's through respiration that the car would, of course, derive power to do whatever it does. The respiration, however, in the car is a little more complex and puts off way more energy than the respiration in organism. In the car, you'd have what we refer to as combustion, where we have a lot of heat energy being given off, but it is, of course, a type of respiration. Then we have excretion, which is not only confined to living things, but non-living things also excrete, as you can attest to the smoke stack from a factory or the tailpipe from a motor vehicle. Nutrition and feeding, of course, they are going to be taken in some form of energy. Fossil fuel, in most cases, is the source of energy for most non-living things. But we are now moving into renewable energy. We up right into the order of a day, which is, of course, our field trip. Field trips can be virtual or otherwise. So we're out here in the school bus going into the rural to look at some organism as young scientists. So we are out for the day. But what we're going to be looking at is classification. And before we can classify, we need to have ourselves a seat and, of course, discuss a bit about classification. Now, this is the act of organizing things in groups based on similarities and, of course, differences. So, of course, things that are similar are going to be in the same group, and those that are not will find themselves in another group. So you'll find in some cases the good students are on this side and the naughty students are on the other side. It's probably a crude way of classifying things, but it is as it is. How is the act of classification done? The act can be as simple as grouping things based on visible characteristics, meaning that which you can see. The complexity of classification has many intermediates and may extend to modern practice such as DNA sequencing to ensure accurate grouping of organisms. This gives rise to the smallest group of which organism can assign, and that smallest group is, of course, species, and it's usually spelled SPECIES, always with a S at the end, and it refers to organisms that are able to interbreed and produce a viable offspring. Viable offspring here meaning that the offspring itself can produce a offspring that will produce another offspring. So when we talk about species, the organism must not only be able to interbreed, but that offspring from the first offspring should be able itself to produce an offspring. Why classify organisms though? It places organisms into smaller, manageable groups. We have to be cognizant of the fact that the planet Earth is not occupied by human only. And more so, our nutrition is that of heterotroph. So if we are heterotrophic organism, then we need to rely on other organisms for food. And if we are able to classify organisms, we might be able to manage that even better. So we are able to classify domestic organism versus those that are feral. We are able, and feral here meaning wild. Talking about wild, if we say feral organism, the organism is wild. So we're able to find our food easily, and of course not consuming things that are toxic. And that is as a result of us classifying things into small manageable groups. So we know we should not eat that. And that is as a result of our classification. To better understand the traits of an organism, what will the organism do? When will the organism mate? What will the organism eat? What happens at a particular time for this organism? How can we care for this organism or use the space that we share with this organism to ensure that living and using the environment is sustainable? To be able to predict behavior, you wouldn't want to have an anaconda as your pet. And that is as a result of us being able to classify that organism, knowing that organism is an apex predator, and you might just fall prey to this predator. The breeding pattern. Now we need to understand where these organisms prefer to be. If you take, for example, the polar bear, because of the classification, we know we need to keep this organism in a very cold environment, as it were, for the Arctic region. Then we look at diet. What is it that the organism need to eat? Will we have to compete with this organism for food? And if so, how do we do so, ensuring that it is sustainable, enough will be left for tomorrow? Then we have to look at the niche. What is the role of the organism in the ecosystem? What it does, what it eats, what it's like, how does it relate with other organisms? Niche, it's a very big word. Then we want to look at where the organism lives. Is it on land? Is it in water? Or is it that it just complete a part of its life cycle in the water, as it were, for the amphibian? Then we look at, of course, to improve the efficient use of space and other resources. Now, if we classify organisms carefully, we are able to live very close to them. Now, you're not going to be living under a manchineel tree, because if you live under the manchineel tree and it rains, then of course the water from the tree and the latex is going to burn the skin, right? Neither are you going to be living anywhere where organisms are going to hurt you. You're not going to be living pretty close to bees hive, having bee hive around your house, because we are able to classify these organisms knowing that this could, of course, be an unfriendly relationship. And neither are you going to be living where we have a whole lot of crocodiles just crawling up. No, you're not going to be doing that. So if we are able to classify organisms, we can better use space so that all organisms can live sustainably, and we're not going to be placing any organism on what we refer to as the edge. When organisms are placed on the edge, then they are closer to becoming endangered, killed, or extinct. To understand and identify how species evolve. When we think of this, we could think about Charles Darwin's visit to the Galapagos Island, where he studied the finch, and they had different bill based on what they were eating. So we can tell how things are changing over time as a result of classification. To protect our environment, it is also very important for us to classify organisms. So there we have 6 reasons for which classification should be done. Of course, the list is in no way exhaustive. Binomial system of classification. Now, as we move from place to place, region to region, country to country, island to island, what we find happening is that the common name of organisms change. So you might call an organism in your country or island X, and the very same organism in my country or island is called Y. Now, to get rid of that, Carolus Linnaeus, a Latin scientist, came up with a naming system. It is called the binomial naming system, or the binomial system. And this system uses the genus and the species name to name organisms. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world. Once you use this binomial system, you are always going to be right, spot on. We're having the same conversation about the same thing. For example, you might be familiar with the term Homo sapien. Homo being the genus, sapien being the species, and once we would have said that anywhere, we know that we're talking about the human being, because that's the binomial system that we use, the naming system that we use to name human. So let's dive a little further in the binomial system. Now the name is written in italics. If you're typing and you're writing the binomial system from Carolus Linnaeus, you are going to be writing it in italics on your computer. If you are writing it in your book, then you want to underline the name. Now, genus is written first and the species is written after. Now, the first letter of a genus is written in uppercase. The first letter of a genus is written in uppercase or capital letters. All the other letters are written in lowercase. So all the species is written in lowercase, and the rest of the genus name is also written in lowercase. So here we have the binomial name, or what we refer to as the botanical name or scientific name for mango. It is Mangifera indica. Mangifera being the genus name and indica being the species name. One might wonder, why do we need to go through all of this? I give you an example. There are two rats, one with a scientific name of Rattus rattus and another Rattus navincicus. Now, if you observe closely here, these rats share the same genus name, Rattus rattus. However, the species name is different. One, Rattus, while the other is navincicus. So we have two rats, Rattus rattus and Rattus navincicus. The thing about classification, it teaches us that these two rats are not able to reproduce and produce viable offspring. Why? They are not from the same species. If you recall, one is from the species Navincicus, while the other is from the species Rattus. Very well. So now you're closer to understanding the whole concept of classification and reasons for classifying organisms. If you've ever heard about a donkey and a horse producing an offspring, that's called a mule. While the mule is a hybrid, it is strong, much taller than the donkey, carry some more load, it is not able to reproduce and produce an offspring. So there we have it. Clearly, the horse and the donkey, they are not of the same species. Though they can interbreed, they will not produce a viable offspring. We're getting closer to the field trip. For our field observation, we're going to be classifying organisms based on visible characteristics, and these include, and these are from the CSEC syllabus. We could look at organism based on airiness. So when we talk about airiness, we are pretty much talking about skin cover. We could talk about, and airiness does not only relate to mammals. We could talk about the trichomes that we're having on leaves. We could talk about what we're seeing on the leg of the crab, and what we see, we have this ear on many other organisms. We could classify organisms based on the color. If you're going to be thinking about a ripe mango, in most cases a green mango is not ready to be harvested. But once the color would have changed, orange or yellow thereabout, then we know that it is ripe. And because of this classification, we are able to package things correctly to get them to the market safe and be able to earn from them. We could also look at shape of organism. How is the organism shape? Is that important? Very, very important. We're going to be looking later at a slide that we're going to be looking at bacteria, and you're going to see that a family of bacteria in most cases can be viewed based on their shape. Venation, popularly used with plants, more so dicotyledonous plant and monocotyledonous plant, where dicotyledonous plant would have net venation in their leaf, while monocots would have a parallel venation. We could look at the number of legs. As the legs change, we could look at, of course, insects. They have 3 pairs of legs. We could look at the arachnids, we could look at the myropod, and at the crustaceans or crustaceans. You will realize that the number of legs change as we move. Number of wings. Birds, they only have 2 wings, but if you were supposed to look at an insect, in some cases, insects are having 2 pairs of wings. So a bird would have just 1, which equivalents to 2 wings, but is of course 1 pair, while an insect would have 2 pairs, which is equivalent to 4 wings. Body segment. We could also look at the number of segments. We know that the arachnid, they have 2 segments, while for insects, they have 3. And of course, the number of segments get larger as we go deeper into classification. Organs found in or on the organisms could also be used to classify the organism, as we classify organism pretty much as prokaryotic organisms and eukaryotic organism, which is pretty much based on organelles being bounded by membranes. Now, there are a lot of words that we could use to describe the shape of organisms when we are classifying. A whole lot of words. And this list here does not represent all the words that can be used. So we could refer to an organism as being elongated. Now, an elongated organism would refer to an organism that is somewhat long, like a straw, right, long. Or you could think about a segmented organism, segment here, meaning that the organism has many parts. Or one would say, in some cases, it could be appendages, all right? Then we could look at the organism as being flat, as it were, for the tapeworm, which is of course a parasite. We could look at the organism as being cylindrical, depending on your view. If you're looking at a flower, and this is of course the flower of a plant, a flower could be that of a tube, or one might say a fluorescence, or it could be open. If you think of a tube, you could think like angel trumpet, that plant there has a nice tube, and you know that the difference, as it were, with a tube on a flower versus open flower, we could look at most plants from the Gramineaceae family, or one might say Poaceae, the grass family. They would have a flower that is pretty much open, while in some cases dicot, in most cases, they will have a flower that are pretty much in a tube or fluorescent. We could look at leaves and the classification of leaf. It is a whole lot of words that we could use. We could use a simple leaf, as it were, for a guava or a mango. Then it gets a little more difficult when we look at compound leaf, as it were, with an ackee leaf. And there are some plants that have even more complex leaf, like pinnately compound, double pinnately compound, palmately compound. We could look at a leaf as being oval, round, or of course elongated. So a whole lot of things there that we could say about the shape of organisms. Now, if you look at this chart here, which is not so much a part of the CXC syllabus, it is used just for emphasis, looking at the importance of shape in identifying organisms. So if we were looking at the bacteria under the microscope, or looking at bacteria under the microscope, we would realize that once the bacteria look anything like the first row, then they belong to the coccus group. And then the second there, you're realizing that these are somewhat rod shaped. So the first was they were pretty much spherical bacteria. They are referred to as coccus. Now, if it is rod shaped, the bacteria is rod shaped, then it belongs to the group we refer to as bacillus. And then we are seeing the spiral bacteria. And you observe here, you're having a better appreciation for the importance of being able to identify shape. Because when you have organisms like these to look at under your microscope, and of course to give a result, a finding, a feedback to solve a problem, it's very important that you understand the difference in the shape. You wouldn't want to be treating for a bacillus when the bacteria is actually a coccus. So you want to make sure that you understand that bit there. Now, grouping organisms in scientific studies. As we go deeper into our study, we will have to have a clearer understanding as to how organisms move, how organisms are grouped. We will have to, of course, continue to do our observation and group organisms firstly by visual characteristics, but we'll also have to get into some more detailed look of organism where we are going to be using things like genetic information. Now, there are 7 levels to grouping organisms for your sciences moving forward. And the mnemonics, one might say, is King Pharaoh or King Patrick, call only female general softly. So once you remember that King Patrick calls only female generals softly, that's the mnemonics to remember the groups that we classify organisms in. Now we could look at kingdom, that's king, phylum for Patrick, call for class, only for order, female for family, general for genus, and you're seeing softly there for species. If you observe the two last names are the two last of a set of classification, the seventh tier classification is of course genus and species, and you will have a better appreciation here. When we classify at that level, we are certain that these things are in the same group and can interbreed. Let us just do a random thing here. Kingdom. If you were supposed to look at the animal kingdom, are you the same as a snake or a lion or a worm? No, but you belong to the same kingdom. But as we go down and down and deeper down into classification and become more specific to the point of species, then we find organisms that are pretty similar and they are even able to interbreed. Now, modern classification uses a five kingdom approach. And the five kingdoms speaks to prokaryotic organisms. These are organisms without organelles in a membrane. Then we have the protists and the fungi and plantae and animae. Now, if you observe, virus here is in red. They are of importance to man. However, it is important to note that they are not a kingdom in themselves. Why viruses are not considered to be a kingdom is that they are not able to exist without being in a host, right? So we know that prokaryote, they have nucleus not bounded by a membrane. So they don't have a nucleus that is bounded by a membrane. All right, and we're going to be talking more about that as we look at the bacteria. So be careful with the word nucleus. It's not properly used, as it were, when we talk about prokaryotic organism, but it's the word that students will understand until they can make the distinction. So they really and truly prokaryotes, they don't have a nucleus that is bounded by a membrane. The genetic information is not enveloped like that. Now, eukaryotic organism, they have membrane-bounded nucleus. Example, the protoctista, the fungi, plants, and animal, their organelles are bounded by membrane. And you're going to be seeing this when we get to cells and we're looking at the various organisms from the different kingdoms. Viruses are not true organisms as they must live within a host and they don't usually have a structure like other organisms. It's important to note that. How are we doing so far? We would have had the basics of classification, and if it seems a little difficult for you just now, it's because you're doing it for the first time. Don't worry yourself. Play back the video however many times you wish, and as you do, it will become a little easier, and as you go through this course in biology, it will just be a walk in the park in days to come.